Hello, I'm Phyllis DiPiano, and I welcome you to our sewing room here at Classic Sewing Magazine. We're going to talk today just about sewing, and are you ready to get started, or have you decided you want to sew? That's always a big decision because there's something motivating people to look at sewing. Am I interested in sewing? Or I've decided to sew, but I don't know where to begin. Our sewing is a journey. It's a journey that we take together as creative people. I love to sew. My mother sewed for me my whole life. She's 93 right now, and I called her last night to talk about when I started sewing because I remember vaguely, and she said I was 5 years old when I started sewing. Now, I have my first piece that I made right here to show you because it illustrates that we all start in the same place. As with any journey, it's the beginning. And how do we take those first steps? Well, I want you to look at this. This is right here, the pride and joy of a 5-year-old girl. This is an apron I made for my grandmother, and she cherished it, wore it, and I look at this now and it's really comical because I didn't understand everything had to be even. Mother just said, I want you to go. She told me how to make it and said, I want you to start. And not to be outdone, when I finished this little cotton apron, I decided it needed some antique lace on it. Now, go figure that. But I sewed by hand. Look at those stitches. Is that not the funniest thing you've ever seen? And look at the hem. Oh my goodness, it's so bad. And gathers, these are so uneven. But I was proud as a peacock when this was finished, and my grandmother Norton wore it with great pride for years. And when she passed away, Mom got this back for me and said, you always keep this. This will remind you of where you started. Are you ready to start today? Or have you decided? Sewing is something that speaks to your heart, and there's a reason that you're interested. Have you seen something that someone has made that you wonder, could I make that? Or do you just love fabric? I love all of it. I love fabric. I love the patterns. I love the sewing machines. But I started just like you will, from the beginning, the very, very basics. And it's truly a step-by-step journey. I think it's one of the most rewarding things that I do because I sew now for my granddaughter. And I love telling her, I made this for you. She's sewing now too. I started her sewing. And there's great pride in the accomplishment of I made it. So let's get started sewing and let's get our thoughts on being creative as we start our journey together. As we begin our sewing journey, we need to think about what we need to get started. My sewing machine is one of my prized possessions, and that is something you will need to sew. Now, if Aunt Mary decides you need Cousin Susie's sewing machine that's been in the closet for 40 years, I'm thinking you don't, because what you want to do is to get a good machine in proper working order. Because there's so many people that have given up sewing because their machine just doesn't function properly. And it's frustrating, and you get real aggravated and think, well, I don't need to do this. The truth of the matter is there are so many wonderful beginning sewing machines that are very affordable that you will enjoy sewing on, that will work properly, because after all, our sewing machines do what we tell them to do. My machine that I started on was my mother's, and it sewed a straight stitch. Now, what is a straight stitch? This is an example of a straight stitch here. It doesn't always go straight. It goes where you tell it, but the stitches line up. The next stitch that would be great to have on your machine is a zigzag. And you can see you can adjust the width and the length of those little movements. That's really all you need, because these are the two basic stitches that you can use to sew anything that you want to. In looking at a sewing machine and deciding what do I need, I would suggest you go to a sewing shop and look at the machines and talk with the people about what that machine will do. The machine is not a toy. It's a piece of equipment that is just exciting to work with, but you want to be sure that you're getting one that you will really, really enjoy sewing on for years. My mother insisted that when we were in high school, we get our own machine. And so I put one on layaway. I worked just doing all kind of odd jobs to pay for it. And when I brought it home, it was like bringing home a newborn baby. I was so excited, and I had it set up in my bedroom, and I would sew every chance that I got. I remember one of my first garments that I made. I was so proud of myself. I had this beautiful blouse cut out, and I made it. And when I finished, one of the sleeves was upside down. I had one arm pointing up and one pointing down. And my mother just laughed, and she said, "You're normal. Everyone starts the same way, by trial and error." So as you're selecting your machine, spend time with a dealer that can help you select something, a machine that you can afford and a machine that you will enjoy sewing on for years. Along with a good sewing machine, you're going to need some accessories, or notions as we call them in the sewing world. Notions. Now that's an interesting term. I say it's because I take a notion to collect them. But the bottom line is this: you just need a few things to get started. First and foremost is a great pair of scissors. Now let me tell you, there have been wars in families over people using mama's sewing scissors to cut other things. So if you invest, and you should, in a great pair of scissors, hide them. Don't let anybody touch them. Keep these strictly for cutting fabric because you want them razor sharp. You also need pins. And I love the kind that are glass head, or these magic pins that are kind of a barrel-shaped head, because you can iron over them and they won't melt. If you get a plastic head pin, you have to be careful with it around your iron. And notice too, these pins are not thick and bulky. These are thin that will glide through your fabric easily. This magic tool right here is a seam ripper. Now you will need this because, like I told you, no one is perfect, and things can be redone by removing stitches with this very carefully and then re-sewing. This is a washable marker because you're going to want to mark things on your fabric as you sew. This iron is a tiny iron that I love to keep in my sewing room because I can put it on a tiny ironing board right next to my sewing machine and press, because pressing is very, very important. And so you'll want to have an iron of some kind in your sewing room. Thread. Thread is wonderful, and there are all kinds of beautiful threads with different colors and textures. And as you begin your career and working with sewing with fabrics, you'll be able to select beautiful threads to use. Another basic is needles. Machine needles, that will be very important. And when you purchase your sewing machine, it will come with a standard sewing needle in it. These are very important. Hand needles, you're always going to have a little touch-up, a little tacking of things. That means basting it or sewing by hand some stitches that will stay in your garment, and you'll need good needles. And last but not least, the tape measure. The tape measure is one of the greatest things because when you need to check a measurement, you can have it right by your side and pull it out, and it will help you in measuring your hem, and to see that your garment is the right length. These are fun to collect, and you'll find many things when you start that you will want to add to your collection. But these are the basics that you need to get started to do beautiful sewing. Loving sewing is loving fabric. And I confess, I love fabric. Fabric can inspire a project. Sometimes you see just a beautiful piece of fabric. You have no idea what you want to make with it, but you got to have it because you know there'll be a great project that you'll come up with your fabric. I collect fabrics. Don't ask me why, but I'm just obsessed with having beautiful fabrics. But to begin, you don't need but just 1 or 2 pieces of fabric to begin your sewing journey. Fabric comes in all patterns, textures, and you look at it and you think, wow, somebody designed this. What a brilliant artist. And that's where the fun comes in, is working with fabric. There are some terms that we have to use to describe fabric that is consistent throughout the sewing industry. This fabric is a beautiful cotton print, and you'll see on the side of this a selvage. There's one on either side indicating that's the side of the fabric that probably was attached to the sides of the mill. But on there, you'll see some really great information. You'll see usually the name of the pattern. You'll see colors. These little polka dots here tell us what colors are in the fabric, so if we're looking for something to match. This diagram here explains it a little clearer. This band is the selvage, and you can see it's a stiffer, stronger band, and it has little tiny holes in it where it attached to the loom. This is a bias. Bias means a cross right here. Now, why is that important? Because it is contra to a cross grain that goes across the fabric or a straight grain. These are important because a straight grain will not stretch. A cross grain will not stretch. But look at the bias. That stretches. And so each has a purpose in identifying its use, and it will indicate the type of fabric you need for the project that you are working on. Well, let's look at some fabrics. This is an exciting thing to see. Fabrics have a right and a wrong side. Now, I think that's an interesting term because are they all wrong? Are they all right? You can usually tell. On the right side of the fabric, the design is printed, it's vivid, and that's the side you want to show. And you make your projects accordingly. Now, in looking at these two, this is one I sewed for you. This is a seam. A seam is where you sew joining 2 fabrics. This is that straight stitch that comes standard on all your machines, joining 2 fabrics. This is your seam allowance, so that you have enough fabric between the edge and your seam that it's very secure. But look what happens when you join the 2 right sides together. You have made a beautiful start at a project. This is where you'll take your iron and iron it out flat, creating 2 fabrics that are joined together. I've often wondered how people design fabric because it's intriguing to me that artists have a blank piece of paper before them when they're designing fabrics. You'll find in the fabric industry there are coordinates, and there are beautiful groups of fabrics that are made to go together. When you select your fabric, do some practice. Get a little extra and do some practice. When I'm teaching someone to sew, I draw lines on the fabric and have them sew to get the feel of what that fabric is. This is a cotton fabric, and it will not slide. That's the good thing I love about it. And so I'll draw off lines and have my new sewist or my granddaughter sew along here to learn to control the machine and get the feel of the fabric. After that's accomplished, and it may be 10 lines across here, not just 2, then I'll draw a curve because so many of our pattern pieces are not straight. They use a straight stitch, but they have a curve. As you explore this wonderful world of fabric, talk with your sewing friends. Get you a sewing buddy because someone that has experience can help you make selections. People in the sewing stores can help you make selections that will give you a great start to your sewing career. And if you're like me, you will look up and see, wow, I've got a great assortment of fabrics to work with. One of the things that you will enjoy on your sewing journey are patterns. Now, I love patterns because if I see a garment that I like, there's usually a pattern to it in a sewing shop. And patterns are now deliverable in two different ways. This is a traditional pattern that is in an envelope, and inside there are the pattern pieces that you have to make the garments that are shown. These pattern pieces are digital downloads, and you can print them in your home, or you can have them printed at a print shop. But either way, they are essential to what we do to duplicate a garment that we see. Now, let me say this. When you are selecting your first pattern, be absolutely sure it is a pattern that a beginner can accomplish. Because if you select a pattern that is for an advanced sewist, right out of the chute, you're going to be very, very frustrated. And so think about that and speak with your sewing buddies, talk with the shop owners, and read about the garment. I love patterns because they tell you everything you need to do. Mom and I were talking last night, and she remembers telling my sister and I, go pick out a pattern that you like that's for a beginner or easy. It will say on the pattern envelope, and we'll figure out how to do it. Everything you need to know is on the pattern. These are typical pattern pieces. This is a very interesting pattern piece here because it says it's cut on the fold. Now, what does that mean? This fabric right here is folded. This edge of the pattern is going to sit right on the fold. And then you cut on the dotted line. That tells you where to cut and that this part right here will have no seam. When you fold it out, this will be one continual piece. Contrasting it to this pattern piece. This pattern piece is cut all the way around it. But in looking at this pattern piece, what does it tell us? First of all, it's going to tell us inside this pattern design, they allowed a 1/2 inch for a hem. Okay, so that's great. We know that when we cut this out, it's going to be the length that's specified on the pattern. This is a fold line. This is not a cut line. This will tell you at some point you are going to fold this fabric back on that line. This is an indicator line, and it says it's the center front. That's going to tell you where the front of your shirt or blouse is. Now, what else does a pattern tell us? A pattern tells us how many we've got to cut. We're cutting 2 of this shirt front. Of course we are. There's 2 sides. And so it tells us what our seams are. All seams 3/8 inch unless it's otherwise indicated. So when we are cutting this out, already included in here is 3/8 inch that you're going to take into your seam. This is what makes sewing fun because it's all right here before us. We just have to read our instructions and follow that. This is a sleeve. Now, we talked about the grain of a fabric earlier. This tells us for this particular piece to properly fold and properly be placed, this has to be on the straight grain of the fabric. Not like this, but on the straight. It tells us to cut 2. Of course, there's 2 sleeves. And it tells us place the hem fold of the sleeve block here. So you'll have a hem fold. But that's what's fun. Everything you need to know is like a road map or on the patterns. This little outfit has a collar. And this little collar is just a cute rounded Peter Pan collar. This pattern piece shows us some additional things. We have a seam variance. This is a 1/4 inch seam, a little bit narrower than the other one. This tells us also what direction on the fabric this piece must go. We're going to cut 4. Of course, this pattern piece, there'll be 2, but there's a back side to it. So it's going to tell you cut 4. Now, you'll want to also be sure that all of your pattern pieces are the same size. You don't want a size 6 outfit with a size 10 collar because it's not going to fit together. So these are just some checks and balances that we have to work with. Patterns are fun. They're collectible as well, and you'll find yourself making possibly the same garment twice or maybe even 3 times by varying your fabrics. It may be you vary your buttons, your trims, but it's great experience. And the only way to learn to sew in the beginning is with great patterns. I encourage you to sit with a sewing friend and look at patterns, talk through what's important to note on those patterns. Because when you're starting out, you may want to know, why are we cutting 4? Okay, simple explanation. You'll never forget it. It's going to have letters on here, the back and the front. This is going to tell you this is the back of the collar. This is the front of the collar. Does it make a difference? Yes, because look how deep the front is and how shallow the back is. So you'll want the collar in the right direction. And these are the fun things, and you'll continually make note of that. Then, in working with your patterns, before you cut anything at all, you'll pin all these pattern pieces to your fabric. Of course, you'll have a bigger piece than this, but you want to make sure all your pattern pieces are placed on your fabric, pinned in place, and then cut with sharp sewing scissors. Have fun as you explore patterns. There may be a pattern design that inspired you to sew or something you aspire to make at some point. I started out as a novice sewer with very simple things. Probably the project I'm most proud of in terms of sewing technique was a christening dress I made for my granddaughter. But the same thing. It's about cutting the pattern and following the pattern. And so as you begin your sewing journey, enjoy patterns. Look at the techniques. Look at the things you love about them and the things that you want to learn to master as you go through your journey. In thinking about starting your sewing journey, it's all about learning. It's all about educating ourselves on the things that are important, and that's technique, our equipment, our fabrics. There are many things I would recommend. Number 1, find a sewing buddy. There's nothing more exciting than sharing what you have learned and your projects with someone that you respect. Preferably a sewing buddy that has more experience than you do, but if not, it's fun to learn together. At Classic Sewing Magazine, we have many ways in which you can learn to sew. First and foremost, when you buy your machine, the dealer that you buy it from offers classes in working with your machine. That's an excellent way to become familiar with your machine and to learn basic sewing. Another way, we have online classes because so many people love learning in their homes. And you can start and stop a video and work on technique. And it's exciting to be all alone and to go step by step through your project. We also have a wonderful event team, the Original Sewing and Quilting Expo. And this is a convention type thing, not huge, but intimate enough that you can come and shop, you can come and take classes, you can see what's going on in the sewing market, and it's really exciting to meet teachers and designers. The important thing to learn is that your sewing journey continues daily. You're going to be learning things. I still love learning things. I love learning a new technique, and you will as well. And you'll look back from your beginning project, like I have here, my little simple, primitive apron I made when I was 5 to garments that I make now that I love. But it was a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. Give yourself time. Don't rush. Enjoy every minute of it, and you will become confident in your ability as a sewist.